At 9:27 a.m. on December 13, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Philip Adair guided his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk into a climbing turn over Assam, India, when 64 Japanese aircraft emerged from the morning haze about 3 miles to the east, flying straight toward his base at Denjan Airfield. At just 23 years old, Adair had already completed 43 combat missions with the 89th Fighter Squadron, escorting aircraft that flew the dangerous hump airlift route. On this particular morning, however, he was the only pilot in the air when the enemy formation appeared. During the previous 8 weeks, Japanese attacks on Allied airfields across northeast India had destroyed 47 transport planes on the ground and killed 112 personnel. Adair's P-40, nicknamed Lulu Bell and marked with the number 44, was armed with 6 .50 caliber Browning machine guns and carried enough ammunition for roughly 12 seconds of continuous firing. The incoming force included 24 Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, escorted by around 40 Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters positioned above and below the bomber stream. Intelligence reports warned that raids of similar size in Burma had achieved hit rates of up to 90% against undefended airfields. Below him, Denjan Airfield held 14 C-47 transport aircraft loaded with vital supplies for Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China, a field hospital caring for 63 wounded soldiers, and fuel reserves sufficient to support hump operations for the next 11 days. If the bombers reached the airfield without resistance, Allied supply operations over the Himalayas would be disrupted for weeks. The closest friendly fighters were stationed at Jorhat, 38 minutes away. Adair glanced at his fuel gauge, full internal tanks, 180 gallons, giving him about 90 minutes of flight time at combat power. The Japanese formation was flying 3,000 feet below him at 240 miles per hour, closing on the airfield. Standard doctrine advised fighter pilots to wait for reinforcements when outnumbered by more than 5 to 1. Adair faced odds of 64 to 1. He could radio for help and shadow the enemy until support arrived, but by then the bombs would likely already be falling. The alternative was to attack alone and attempt to disrupt the bombing run. Adair pushed the throttle forward. The Allison V-1710 engine responded instantly as manifold pressure climbed to 54 inches. The P-40 surged to 320 miles per hour. He maneuvered into position 4,000 feet above the bomber formation, approaching from the south with the sun at his back. The Oscar fighters had not yet seen him, their focus remained fixed on the target ahead. Surprise was his single advantage. Japanese pilots expected interception near the airfield, not more than 20 miles out. He planned his approach carefully: strike the lead bombers first, ignore the fighters at the start, disrupt their accuracy, force them to scatter, and compel them to abandon the run. Could a single P-40 disrupt 64 enemy aircraft? Stay with the story to see how it unfolds. Now, back to Adair. The lead group of Sally bombers flew in tight formation, 6 aircraft arranged in 2 3-plane Vs. Adair rolled inverted, dropped the nose, and dived from their high 7 o'clock position. His speed increased rapidly, 360 miles per hour and climbing. The Allison engine screamed at full power as the distance closed. The bomber crews still had not noticed him. At 800 yards, Adair opened fire. His .50 caliber guns thundered, tracers streaking into the lead bomber. The rounds walked up the aircraft's left wing, ripping fabric and throwing sparks as metal shattered. The bomber's port engine burst into orange flame, thick black smoke pouring from the cowling. The formation immediately broke apart. Bombers veered left and right as the precise V formation dissolved into disorder. Adair pulled up sharply, enduring 7 gs as he rolled to the right. 40 Oscar fighters were now diving toward him. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was among the most agile fighters in the Pacific Theater. Powered by a 1,150 horsepower Nakajima HA-115 engine, it could reach 329 miles per hour at 13,000 feet and outturn any American fighter. Its distinctive combat flaps allowed pilots to lose speed rapidly in tight turns without stalling, an advantage Japanese pilots used effectively. Over the previous 6 months, Oscars had downed 63 Allied fighters over Burma and northeast India. Adair's P-40N was faster in straight flight but could not match the Oscar's turning ability. Its Allison V-1710-81 engine produced 1,240 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute, giving it a top speed of 378 miles per hour below 12,000 feet. In prolonged turning combat, however, the heavier American fighter lost energy more quickly than the lighter Japanese aircraft. Standard tactics against Oscars were clear: never turn with them, rely on speed, strike quickly, disengage, and reset. Adair could not disengage. If he broke away, the bombers would regroup and complete their attack on Denjan. He needed to keep pressure on the formation, keep them scattered and unsettled, even if it meant facing 40 Oscars alone. The first 4 Oscars attacked from his high 10 o'clock position in a loose finger 4 formation. Adair rolled left, pulled the nose up, and fired a 2-second burst at the lead fighter. The rounds passed high, and the Oscar broke right, its wingman following. Adair reversed direction and dove to preserve speed. 2 more Oscars descended from above. He spotted them at 400 yards, pulled into a climbing left turn, and fired again, but scored no hits. His ammunition counter showed 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns, enough for roughly 6 more firing passes at his current rate. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were trying to reorganize. 3 groups of 6 aircraft each were moving back into formation. If they succeeded, they would resume the bombing run. Adair estimated he had about 90 seconds before they reached their release point over Denjan. He rolled level, pushed the throttle fully forward, and dove toward the bombers once more. 8 Oscars followed him down. The P-40 accelerated to 405 miles per hour in the dive, a speed the Oscars could not match. Adair opened the distance, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand bomber group. At 300 yards, he fired. Tracers struck the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi A6M radial detonated in a fireball. The aircraft rolled to the right, trailing flames and debris, forcing its wingman to break formation to avoid collision. Adair applied rudder, skidded left, and fired again at another sally. His rounds punched through the bomber's thin fuselage. The Ki-21 offered no armor protection for its crew and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. Designed in 1936, it was outdated by 1943, yet it could still carry 2,250 pounds of bombs, enough to devastate Denjan airfield. The Oscar fighters were closing in again, this time a dozen of them. Adair checked his gauges. Fuel was down to 162 gallons. His ammunition counter showed 650 rounds remaining. The bombers were now 19 miles from Denjan. He had no more than 4 minutes before they reached bomb release range. Then his engine began to overheat. The Allison V-1-1710-81 was a liquid-cooled power plant. Coolant flowed through channels in the cylinder heads and engine block, absorbing heat from combustion before passing through a radiator mounted beneath the fuselage. At combat power levels above 50 inches of manifold pressure, the engine produced extreme heat. The cooling system was engineered to sustain those conditions for about 20 minutes. Adair had already been running at full power for 11 minutes. His coolant temperature gauge read 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal operation was around 210 degrees Fahrenheit. At 250 degrees Fahrenheit, engine failure would begin. He faced 3 choices: reduce power and allow the engine to cool, disengage and return to base, or continue the fight and risk losing the engine over enemy territory. The Sally bombers were still 17 miles from Denjan, well within bombing range and still a serious threat. Adair kept the throttle fully forward. 2 Oscars approached head-on. Their combined closing speed exceeded 600 miles per hour. Both fighters opened fire at 500 yards. Adair saw the muzzle flashes and the 7.7 mm tracers moving toward his nose. He returned fire. His heavier .50 caliber rounds carried greater energy and longer range. At 350 yards, his fire struck the left Oscar's engine cowling. The lightly built fighter shuddered, veered left, and streamed white coolant vapor. Its wingman followed it away. Adair rolled right and dove. His coolant temperature climbed to 240 degrees Fahrenheit. The Sally bombers were now 15 miles from their target. Two formations of 6 aircraft had reformed into bombing Vs. A third formation remained scattered, with 3 bombers struggling to rejoin. Adair attacked the lead formation again. 6 Oscars attempted to intercept him. He dove past them at 390 miles per hour, too fast for pursuit. At bomber altitude, he leveled out and fired on the lead Sally. His first burst struck the bomber's right wing root. The wing structure failed, the outer panel folded upward, and tore free. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. No parachutes appeared. The crew went down with the aircraft. The formation broke apart once more. Bombers scattered in 3 directions, eliminating any coordinated bombing. Even if they released their payloads, the bombs would fall across miles of jungle instead of the airfield. Adair pulled up sharply. His coolant gauge showed 248 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine ran rough, and vibration traveled through the control stick. Detonation had begun in the cylinders, pre-ignition caused by excessive heat. If power was not reduced soon, the engine would seize. 8 Oscars dived on him from above. He saw them too late and rolled left, but not fast enough. 7.7 mm rounds tore through his right wing. Fabric ripped, metal bent. One round struck the right aileron control rod, making the response soft and imprecise. Maintaining level flight now required extra right stick pressure. Another burst climbed up the fuselage. Rounds sparked off the engine cowling, and one pierced the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across the windscreen. The temperature gauge climbed past 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Steam poured from the cowling seams. Oil pressure dropped. The Allison was failing. Adair pulled the throttle back. RPM fell from 3,000 to 2,400. The remaining power was insufficient to hold altitude. The P-40 began to descend, first at 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The Oscars circled above, waiting. Then the engine caught fire. A fire in a liquid-cooled aircraft engine follows a predictable pattern. Burning coolant vapor ignites first, then flames are drawn forward along the cowling by airflow. If the fire reaches the fuel lines on the engine's left side, the aircraft explodes. Adair likely had about 30 seconds. Standard procedure called for immediate engine shutdown and bailout, but he was only at 8,000 feet, descending rapidly, and still 12 miles from friendly territory over jungle patrolled by Japanese forces. He chose to keep the engine running. The Allison's fuel mixture could be adjusted manually. Adair pulled the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, starving the engine. The fire weakened. He pushed the mixture forward again. The engine coughed, then continued running, though roughly. Power output dropped to roughly 60%, insufficient to climb and barely enough to maintain level flight. He was now committed to flying home with a burning, damaged engine or abandoning the aircraft over hostile ground. The Sally bombers were 13 miles from Dingen. They were still close enough to turn back, but their formations had collapsed. Individual bombers headed southeast toward Burma. The raid was effectively over. The airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest toward his base at Naguli, 43 miles away, about 15 minutes of flight time if the engine survived. 6 Oscars followed him. At 7,000 feet, oil pressure dropped to 0. The Allison relied on oil pressure to lubricate the crankshaft, camshaft, and connecting rods. Without lubrication, metal ground against metal. Friction produced heat, heat caused expansion, and components seized. Adair felt vibration increase. The propeller began to windmill unevenly. Power fell further. Airspeed dropped to 180 miles per hour. The P-40's stall speed was 120. The margin between controlled flight and a stall was shrinking. Behind him, the Oscars closed to 400 yards. They did not fire. They waited for the engine to fail completely, for him to bail out or crash. One Oscar pulled alongside, close enough for Adair to see the pilot's face. The Japanese pilot pointed downward, signaling him to land and surrender. Adair ignored the gesture. At 6,000 feet, smoke filled the cockpit, not from the engine fire, but from electrical wiring behind the instrument panel. Rounds that struck the fuselage had damaged control cables and the electrical system. Smoke burned his eyes and throat. He slid the canopy open. A sudden blast of wind cleared part of the smoke, but the slipstream made breathing harder. His airspeed dropped to 160 miles per hour. The Oscars pulled back. They had no intention of wasting ammunition. The American pilot was effectively finished. His aircraft was badly damaged. The engine was failing. A crash into the jungle seemed inevitable. The enemy fighters climbed higher, observing as he descended. At 4,000 feet, Adair's right aileron control cable snapped. The aileron swung fully out of position. The P-40 rolled sharply to the right, and the nose pitched down into a dive. He pulled back on the control stick with both hands. There was no response. The elevator cables were damaged. Pitch control was gone. The nose continued downward as airspeed climbed, 200 miles per hour, then 220, then 250. The jungle rushed closer. Altitude dropped through 3,000 feet, then 2,500, then 2,000. Impact was moments away. Then an idea formed. The damaged aileron forced the right wing down, while the broken elevator cables left the stabilizer fixed in a nose-down position. Gravity and airflow were driving the aircraft into an uncontrolled dive. But aerodynamics could work the other way as well. If Adair rolled the aircraft inverted, the damaged aileron would force the right wing up instead of down. The elevator locked-in nose-down trim would push the tail upward, raising the nose. Flying upside down would reverse the effects of the damage. What was killing him upright might keep him alive inverted. At 1,800 feet above the jungle, Adair rolled the P-40 fully upside down. -1 G pressed him against his shoulder harness. Blood rushed to his head, and his vision darkened at the edges. The fuel system, designed for positive G forces, struggled to deliver fuel. The Allison engine coughed, sputtered, nearly failed, then caught again, running rough but still producing power. The nose lifted. The rate of descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, flying inverted at 140 miles per hour. Adair held that position for 40 seconds. Airspeed increased to 160 miles per hour. He was climbing slowly, about 50 feet per minute, but he was climbing. Then fuel starvation returned. The engine began cutting out. He rolled upright. Instantly, the damaged controls forced the nose down again. The P-40 descended at 600 feet per minute. Adair waited until he lost 300 feet, then rolled inverted once more. The nose came up again. He gained 200 feet before fuel loss forced another roll upright. The cycle repeated, inverted to climb, upright to let fuel flow. Roll, climb. Roll, descend. Roll, climb. Above him, 6 Oscars watched in disbelief. A burning American P-40 with crippled controls refused to fall, clawing upward with the persistence of a wounded animal that would not give up. One Oscar dove in to investigate. Adair saw it coming, rolled inverted to gain altitude, then rolled upright directly toward the Japanese fighter. The Oscar broke away. Whether the American pilot was reckless or desperate no longer mattered. The Oscars chose not to engage and turned east toward Burma. Adair continued his rolling climb toward Naguli. His fuel gauge read 83 gallons. His oil pressure gauge read 0. It had been pinned there for 9 minutes. The engine should have seized long ago. By all logic, it should have failed completely. Yet it continued to run, defying mechanical limits. The Allison was operating on inertia, friction, and whatever thin oil film remained inside. Altitude passed 3,000 feet, then 4,000. Naguli base lay 21 miles southwest, about 11 minutes away at his current speed. His coolant temperature gauge no longer functioned, the needle had melted off. Smoke still poured from the cowling, but the flames were gone. Either the fire had consumed its fuel or the lack of coolant had starved it. At 5,000 feet, Adair spotted Naguli airfield ahead, the runway, the tower, the revetments. Safety was in sight. But a new problem appeared. The landing gear was hydraulically operated, powered by the engine. With the engine barely running, any loss of power during gear extension would mean a crash short of the runway. A belly landing risked rupturing fuel tanks and igniting a fire. The gear had to be down and locked before the engine failed. He reached for the gear lever. His right hand shook, not from fear, but from carbon monoxide poisoning. Smoke had filled the cockpit for 14 minutes. He pulled the lever. Nothing happened. The P-40's hydraulic system required 1,000 psi, generated by an engine-driven pump. With minimal engine output, pressure was insufficient. The gear remained locked up. There was a backup, a manual hand pump on the left side of the cockpit. 28 strokes could manually pressurize the system. Adair grabbed the pump with his left hand, keeping his right on the control stick. He pumped. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. The gear did not move. The pump required both hands, but releasing the stick meant losing control. The damaged surfaces would immediately force the nose down. He reached behind his seat, loosened his lap belt, wrapped it around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and pulled it tight. The improvised restraint held the stick near neutral, not perfect, but enough to keep the aircraft flying straight. He took the pump with both hands and worked it hard. 5 strokes. 10. 15. At stroke 23, resistance increased. Pressure was building. At 28, he heard a dull thud beneath the cockpit. The left main gear extended and locked. 3 seconds later, the right followed. The P-40 became heavy with drag. Airspeed dropped from 160 miles per hour to 135, still above stall speed, but with little margin. The engine was producing perhaps 40% power, barely enough to hold altitude. The runway was 7 miles ahead. 3 minutes. His vision narrowed as gray crept in from the edges. Carbon monoxide was impairing his thinking. He shook his head and focused on the runway. 6 miles. The one remaining temperature gauge showed 310 degrees, well beyond the red line. Internal engine components were expanding. Clearances were disappearing. Failure was imminent. 5 miles. Tower personnel at Naguli saw him approach a smoking P-40, flying unevenly, gear down. They expected a normal landing, flaps down, reduced speed touchdown on the mains. But the flaps were hydraulic too. With limited pressure, he could not lower both gear and flaps. The gear was down. The flaps stayed up. A flapless landing required higher speed, 120 miles per hour instead of 90, and a longer roll. The runway was 4,000 feet long. Under ideal conditions, it was just enough. If the engine kept running. If he landed smoothly. At 2 miles from the runway, the engine stopped. The propeller windmilled, then froze. No power. No thrust. The P-40 became a glider, an inefficient one. Its glide ratio was about 8 to 1. From 2,000 feet, 3 miles were possible. The runway was 2 miles away. In theory it could be done. But battle damage added drag. Bullet holes disrupted airflow. The real glide ratio was closer to 6 to 1. He was not going to make the runway. He was about to crash short in the jungle. After surviving attacks from 64 Japanese aircraft, after flying upside down for 11 minutes, and after coaxing a failing engine for 15 miles, he would still fall just 200 yards from safety because the engine stopped at the worst possible time. Then he recalled something from his training, something an instructor had once mentioned about P-40 glide performance. It involved flying inverted. In a standard glide, an aircraft descends nose first, with gravity pulling it downward while the wings create lift. When inverted, however, the aerodynamics are reversed. The wing camber, designed to produce upward lift when upright, generates a downward force when upside down. Yet at certain angles of attack, this reversal can result in less drag than normal flight. In theory, an inverted glide could increase range by lowering drag. This idea had been briefly discussed during training, but no instructor expected a pilot to actually rely on it. With nothing left to lose, he decided to try. He rolled the aircraft inverted at 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway. Blood rushed to his head and his vision began to narrow. He maintained the inverted attitude, watching the jungle pass beneath him, or above him depending on perspective. Orientation became confusing. The airspeed remained steady at 125 miles per hour. The descent rate stabilized at 500 feet per minute, an improvement over the 700 feet per minute he had experienced while flying upright. The tower operators at Nagili watched an inverted P-40 approach with its landing gear extended. Lowering the gear while inverted was aerodynamically incorrect and placed serious structural stress on the aircraft. The gear doors, designed to handle airflow from below, were now taking loads from above. Despite this, the landing gear held and the P-40 continued its inverted approach. On the ground, a crew chief, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez, observed the scene through binoculars. He saw the upside-down aircraft, the extended landing gear, and smoke trailing from the engine. His immediate assumption was that a Japanese pilot had captured a P-40 and was attempting to attack the airfield. Martinez ran toward the nearest .50 caliber machine gun position, followed by 3 other ground crew members. They reached the gun emplacement and began swinging the weapon toward the incoming aircraft. At 400 feet altitude and half a mile from the runway threshold, Adair was still inverted. His vision was rapidly fading. Gray tunnels closed in as carbon monoxide and negative G forces impaired his brain. He likely had no more than 20 seconds of consciousness left. He needed to roll upright, align with the runway, and land. If he rolled too early, the damaged controls would force the nose down and cause him to crash short. If he waited too long, he would overshoot the runway. At 200 feet altitude, 300 yards from the threshold, Adair rolled the aircraft right side up. The damaged aileron immediately forced the right wing downward. He responded with left stick, struggling against the aircraft and forcing the wings level. The nose kept trying to drop. He pulled back on the stick. The broken elevator cables gave him limited control, not much, but just enough. The P-40 descended toward the runway on a steep path, nose high, wings shaking as it fought to stay airborne. Martinez's gun crew followed the aircraft closely. The P-40 was clearly damaged. Smoke streamed from its frame. It could have been friendly. It could have been hostile. In 3 seconds, the aircraft would cross the runway threshold. Martinez had to make a decision, fire or hold. He chose to hold fire. The aircraft crossed the threshold at 90 feet, descending fast, too fast and too steep. The P-40 dropped the final 90 feet in 4 seconds. Its main wheel struck the concrete runway with force. A 7G impact. The landing gear struts fully compressed. The tail wheel slammed down. Metal screamed. The right main gear failed. The right wing dipped. The wingtip struck the runway and dug in. The aircraft ground looped to the right, spinning 180 degrees and throwing sparks and chunks of concrete. It slid backward for 200 feet before stopping. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. Fire crews rushed toward the aircraft. Philip Adair remained still in the cockpit for 12 seconds. Then he released his shoulder harness, stood, and climbed onto the wing. His legs gave way. He steadied himself on the wing root. Ground crew reached him and helped him down. Martinez arrived with the fire crew. They opened the cowling. The Allison engine was destroyed. Pistons were seized. The crankshaft was warped. The oil pan had ruptured. Coolant was everywhere. Adair and Martinez walked around the aircraft, assessing the damage. They counted 16 bullet holes in the fuselage, 7 in the right wing, and 4 in the left. One round had completely severed the right aileron control cable. Another had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third had cut through 2 electrical wiring bundles behind the instrument panel. The engine had suffered catastrophic damage from overheating and oil loss. Every cylinder was scored. 3 connecting rods had fused to the crankshaft. The cooling system was ruined. Lulu Bell would never fly again. But Adair had saved Dingen Airfield. Intelligence reports later confirmed that all 24 Sally bombers had turned back without releasing their ordnance. The Japanese formation scattered 15 miles short of the target. 40 Oscar fighters escorted empty bombers back to Burma. No bombs struck Allied facilities. There were 0 ground casualties. 14 C-47 transports remained operational. The hump airlift continued without disruption. On December 16, 1943, 3 days after the mission, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the engagement. He detailed the attack sequence, his inverted flying method, and the landing approach. Flight surgeons examined him. Carbon monoxide levels in his blood were still elevated 72 hours after the mission. They determined he had flown the final 11 minutes with severe carbon monoxide poisoning, an impairment level that should have rendered him unconscious. He had remained functional through determination alone. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma-India theater, presented 2nd Lieutenant Adair with the Silver Star. The citation read, "For gallantry in action against enemy forces on December 13, 1943, when Lieutenant Adair, flying alone, engaged and disrupted a formation of 64 enemy aircraft attacking Allied installations, continuing his attack despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, thereby preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities." Adair flew 95 additional combat missions with the 80th Fighter Group. He achieved ace status with 5 confirmed kills. On his final mission in July 1944, he shot down 2 key .43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 30 years. He retired as a full colonel in 1971. The 80th Fighter Group, known as the Burma Banshees, continued combat operations until August 1945. The unit destroyed 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on the ground. 63 pilots were killed or listed as missing. Their skull insignia became one of the most recognizable markings in the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never gained the fame of the P-51 Mustang or the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower than both and ineffective above 15,000 feet. By 1943, it was considered outdated. But in the hands of determined pilots like Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter demonstrated that combat success was not defined by specifications, it was defined by the pilot's skill and resolve. 1 pilot. 1 obsolete fighter. 64 enemy aircraft. On December 13, 1943, Philip Adair proved that overwhelming odds mean nothing when someone refuses to quit. His solution to damaged controls, alternating between inverted and upright flight for 11 minutes, defied established flight procedures. His inverted landing approach with landing gear extended had never been attempted before and was never repeated. That is the story of the Burma Banshees and the day a single P-40 pilot disrupted an entire Japanese air raid. If stories like this remind you why history matters, tap the like button, subscribe for more forgotten heroes, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and whether anyone in your family served in the CBI theater. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.